I think there's something pretty telling to the fact that you start to see that stupid scene in vampire movies where, oh, the cross, where'd you read that? That doesn't hurt us or whatever. And what still does hurt a vampire is usually sunlight that stays, or fire, and those are just very physics based ways to kill a vampire. Like if you literally consume the body that the creature inhabits, it's a ghost. Then it's not a vampire if it survives at all. So they fall back on very sort of physics based ways of killing a vampire, which really just does away with any aspect of God. Or if you don't, or you can still just contextualize it as the supernatural good. Any good classic monster story worth its salt has to acknowledge that there's definite evil, but there's also definite good. I touched on this a bit in my last stream, and I just recently cut that out as its own video too. One of the things you see, and one of the I think reasons for and consequences of people trying to take away the villainousness of a villain, or take away the severity of them, or take away some of the terror of them, is the fact that they can't, if they fully acknowledge full-on elemental evil, then you have to acknowledge full-on elemental good. And traditionally that's always been, God, however you want to conceive of him. And that's, the vampire story is a classic example of that. It's just perfect. Even silver from the silver bullet of a werewolf, is usually comes from the idea of silver as the purity of the metal, but silver is often commonly used in high church and sacramentals and stuff like that. You can also go back to the silver pieces that Judas had to give or was paid. So there are all these religious elements to it. And so you take away the elemental evil, you take away the elemental good, and you can kind of look back and see steps in this progression. One of the things I find interesting is Stephen King's writings. Stephen King just can't bring himself to it's funny watching him try to handle this. I'm thinking specifically of three stories. I'm thinking of Stephen King's It, Salem's Lot, and Needful Things. All right, so you've got a pretty evil elemental villain in all of those, right? You've got Dracula himself, Barlow. You've got this Lovecraftian entity, ancient entity from space, It, and then you've also got the devil himself, in Needful Things. So you have definite elemental evils in those stories, and the person to really combat that evil, or the representation of the opposite force, is never any kind of preacher or anybody related or associated with God. In fact, in Salem's Lot, there is a priest, but he's having like a crisis of faith. Okay, fine. But it has to be what's so funny in Salem's Lot is it's basically an analog for Stephen King himself, right? A young writer, teacher guy, who's very just, he's level-headed, and it was the sheriff, I think, in Needful Things, who's a very smart man, so like what is the weakness, or what's the combat for the devil? Well, just somebody who's very smart and sees what's going on, and that kind of, there's a little more to it than that, but no, that doesn't really make any sense. I think It comes the closest to really selling the idea, because you have the magic of childhood friendship, the innocence of that being something that can combat the evil or the monster. And I think that works pretty well, especially from the roots that he gathered that story from. But you still have the supernatural good, you call it the turtle or whatever in It, who's trying to help them, in some way. And there's even hints at something even bigger than the turtle, because there's a magic that they share, in their friendship. So that came to the closest, because you're also, even though he didn't have to say directly God or innate good, he's dealing with a universally understood purity and innocence of childhood, especially childhood friendships. So that kind of makes it work. But it's funny to see these authors, our filmmakers, really try and come to terms with the fact that we don't want to mention God. They don't even want to, any kind of idea of God. And it's gotten to the point now where monster stories straight up ridicule certainly the Catholic Church, but other kind of religious representations as well. So I think that hurts these horror stories, these monster stories, and it makes them fall into the aspect or to the strain of films where, I talked in the last stream about the problem of too many sympathetic villains. Another problem, which isn't quite as prevalent as the too many sympathetic villains, but another problem with monster movies or horror stories is that they just kind of go full on nihilistic. Like, the monster's killing everybody. He's gonna kill everybody. If anybody survives, it's probably just for about a day before they die too. It's just that those kind of movies don't really. Like, what are you even trying to say with that? I think to some small degree, there's a catharsis that those movies can fulfill for people. But I've never really understood that kind of slasher movie enthusiast idea, where like, oh, I love horror film. I'm always watching, oh, the more they chop somebody up, the better. I mean, I think, like I said, there can be some sort of measured catharsis. Maybe somebody can get out of that. It's not really something appealing to my psychological makeup. But people who just get off on watching that stuff over and over and over and every day, I really am at a loss to understand what the appeal is there. Um, Other than that, it's just sort of some sort of tribalism, like I identify as a horror fan, because I love a good monster movie. I love a good, you might even call it a horror movie if it's a really good contextualization of good versus evil, if it's a really good portrayal of that battle. And it doesn't mean that good has to win in the end every single time. Sometimes you can sort of make a statement about, the good guys didn't win in this one because they lost their faith or because they took this misstep or something. You can tell some sort of lesson of it if you want. As I said before, I said no number of times, I love the original Halloween, which is kind of ironic because this is considered the first slasher film by some people. I don't really see it as a slasher movie. I mean, you don't see much blood or guts or anything in that movie. It's really a story about the elemental evil. It's a story about the elemental boogeyman, as I've said in previous video. And they can't find him at the end. And John Carpenter's original idea was that's because evil's always out there. The boogeyman, so to speak, is always out there. Laurie Strode escapes. She's okay. But the evil is still out there. That's the idea. So, I wasn't crazy with the sequels and stuff. But yeah, if a monster movie's gonna work, I don't know. You guys can tell me. I know some of you here. I know, horror is one of those crazy popular franchises. It's like almost right up there with anime. There's always, people very, very proud of loving horror films. And again, I'm not anti-horror films. I like quite a few of them, quite a bit myself. But I just never understood this, need to watch or even glory in sort of the low grade, B movie level gore, for no reason, just because you like it. That's just kind of, I don't know, that kind of concerns me a bit. But you can tell me if you're one of those people what you get out of it. I like stories about good versus evil. I think it's in horror films or monster movies, as I kind of call them, because those are the ones that I gravitate more towards, are just a perfect example of how you can take fiction to use it to recontextualize a real world struggle. And they're great. I love that.